I remember the smell of cold stone, not the sun-warmed stone of a city wall, where limestone drinks light all day and gives it back at dusk. This was different. This was stone that never learned warmth, stone that had been breathing darkness for centuries, soaking up secrets the way a grave soaks up names. That night, we didn't wear armor. No mail, no helmets, no shining steel to announce us to the world above. Only coarse wool against skin, a few small oil lamps, and the kind of silence that makes you hear your own blood moving. A guide went first, carrying a torch low to keep the flame steady. The light crawled across damp walls and made the stone look alive, slick, uneven, scarred by time. As the fire passed, marks appeared in the rock, spirals, star-like cuts, lines that weren't Latin and weren't carved for beauty. I stared too long, trying to make meaning out of shapes. Hugues de Payens leaned close enough that I felt his breath. "Don't look at them too long," he said. Not angry, not fearful, just certain. Some signs only need one glance to start looking back. He spoke like a man who had already learned the price of curiosity. I wasn't a knight, I was a scribe, barely more than a boy when they pulled me out of a quiet life in Champagne and threw me into Jerusalem as if I were a stone tossed into a well. They chose me for simple reasons. I could read, I could write, and I could keep my mouth shut. Out in the streets, people believed the crusade was a holy storm. In truth, it was a market for faith, for relics, for power. But beneath all that noise, Hugues and the men who followed him moved like a blade hidden in cloth. They weren't looking for applause, they were looking for a door. We reached it in a place where the corridor narrowed and the ceiling pressed down. The torchlight revealed an archway that didn't lead anywhere because it had been sealed. Not with wood, not with iron, but with fitted stone slabs, stacked tight as if the wall had always been whole. The guide knelt, feeling for a seam with his fingertips. He found something, some hidden catch, some ancient trick, and when it shifted, it made a sound so small it was almost imagined. Then the first slab loosened, and cold air breathed out at us. It didn't smell like treasure. It smelled like dust trapped for 1,000 years, like leather, like old paper, like a library buried alive. Hugh stepped forward. He didn't touch the stone right away. He looked at the men behind him, 9 of them, the founders, the ones people would one day sing about and argue over. There was no priest with a book, no choir, no incense, only those faces and that torchlight and the weight of what we were about to do. He turned to me. "Write this into your memory," he said, "not on paper." I swallowed. "Because paper can be taken," I whispered. He didn't smile. "Because paper can burn." Then he spoke the oath. It wasn't the kind of oath people expect from soldiers. There was no promise of glory, no vow of conquest. It wasn't even a vow meant for kings or bishops. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. A promise to keep a secret. A promise to guard something that was not gold. A promise that once spoken could not be safely spoken again. As he finished, the men around him placed their hands on the stone, one after another, as if sealing the words into the wall itself. Their palms were calloused, scarred, hands that knew swords, now pressed flat like hands of monks. I stood at the edge, holding my unused parchment, feeling suddenly ashamed of ink. The guide worked the mechanism again. The slabs shifted wider. Dust fell in thin curtains. The torch flame bent as the air changed, and the darkness beyond the stones opened like a throat. I expected, some childish part of me expected, glitter, coins, something bright. Instead, the darkness stayed dark. Only the cold came first. Cold that climbed into the lungs and made every breath feel sharp. Cold that told you the earth had been waiting, patient and indifferent. Hughes didn't hesitate. He lowered his torch into the opening, then stepped through. The others followed, one by one, shoulders turning sideways to fit. Their cloaks brushed the stone and dragged dust into the air. I went last because that is where scribes always go, behind, gathering what others leave behind. The first steps were narrow and steep. The stone under my boots was damp. I kept one hand on the wall, sliding my fingers along it for balance. The rock felt slick and strangely smooth in places, as if many hands had done the same thing long before mine. Above us, Jerusalem still breathed, guards changing shifts, the city settling, distant voices fading into sleep. But down here, those sounds thinned to nothing. Down here, you could hear the torch crackle, you could hear cloth scrape stone, you could hear your own blood trying to speak. We went descending. The air grew heavier. The torchlight revealed arches and joints that didn't match the work of Crusaders, stones fitted without mortar, cuts too clean, too sure, work that looked older than the arguments of men who claimed to own this place. At one bend, the torchlight caught another set of markings, spirals and star patterns, deeper than scratches, carved with intention. My eyes tried to read them the way they read letters. Hughes felt it without turning. He raised one hand, and we stopped. In that stillness, I understood something I didn't want to admit. This wasn't just an exploration. It wasn't even a mission. It was a change, a crossing. Whatever waited beneath the Temple Mount, it had already begun to shape us, and we had only just stepped onto the first stair. We moved again, slower now, as if speed might offend the stone. The guide paused at another narrow place, tested the ground with his foot, then gestured us onward. The torchlight swam over the walls, and shadows shifted like living things, but nothing moved except us. Still, every step felt like permission taken. At the bottom of a short flight, Hughes stopped and looked back up the stairwell, as if measuring how far the world had become. "We were called defenders," he murmured, mostly to himself. No one answered. He looked at me again, at my hands, at the blank page I carried like a habit I couldn't break. "Up there," he said, "people will tell stories about what we are. They'll say we're here for war. They'll say we're here for God. They'll say we're here for pilgrims." He leaned closer, and his voice dropped to the level of confession. "But the road we guard," he said, "is not only on the surface." Then he turned, and the torch moved forward, and the darkness swallowed the last hint of the world above. I followed because I had been chosen not to fight, but to remember. And as the stairwell curved and the light shrank behind us, I realized the truth of what Hughes had told me. This story did not begin on a battlefield. It began under stone, where the smallest flame is enough to reveal a mark, and one mark is enough to change the course of men who thought they came to Jerusalem for something simple. We went down, and the earth, cold and patient, closed around us, like a vow. The Temple Mount is never truly quiet, not even at night. Above ground, the city breathes in layers, boots of centuries changing shifts, the soft hiss of oil in braziers, distant voices fading into prayer and sleep. Wind moves across stone steps and under arches like a restless animal. Somewhere, a door closes. Somewhere, a chain clinks. Jerusalem is always awake in some corner. But what unsettled me most wasn't the noise. It was the emptiness beneath it. I learned to hear it in small ways. A floor slab that answered with a hollow note under my heel. A patch of stone that felt colder than it should. A corridor where the air seemed to thin as if it were leaning over a hidden drop. The men around Hughes de Payens acted as though they had been waiting for this place their entire lives. They moved through the Temple Mount complex with the patience of people who were not simply living there, but reading it, measuring it, listening for what the stones remembered. By day, we wore our public faces. We trained, we prayed, we escorted pilgrims. We let the city see the image it expected. Poor knights, disciplined and pious, guardians of the road. But at night, the true rhythm began. The same few men would gather in silence. Tools appeared, rope, wedges, small iron bars, lamps with low flames. They didn't carry these things like men preparing for battle. They carried them like men preparing for work. And there's a specific kind of focus that settles on a person when they are about to do something forbidden. It's not excitement, it's not fear, it's a narrowing, a shutting out of everything unnecessary. I was pulled into that narrowing whether I wanted it or not. At first, I told myself I was only a scribe, a witness, a recorder, someone who would keep track of supplies and words and names. Then Hughes placed a measuring rod in my hands. It was simple wood, worn smooth, marked not in the neat divisions I'd seen in European workshops, but with carved ticks that didn't match anything I recognized. It was the kind of object that feels ordinary until you realize someone, somewhere, used it for a reason. "Whose measure is this?" I asked. He didn't answer in the way I expected. He didn't give me a name or a story I could repeat. He only said, "It belonged to those who built before us." And suddenly, the rod felt heavier. We moved that night through passages where Crusader masonry blended with older work, stones fitted tightly, seams clean, blocks too precise to be the quick repairs of an occupying army. The torchlight crawled over walls and made every joint and shadow look like a hidden instruction. In one corridor, I saw markings I couldn't ignore, spirals, star-like cuts, lines that seemed to repeat. I felt an urge rise in me, a scholar's hunger to stare until the pattern surrendered its meaning. But Hughes stopped me with a gesture, not harshly, just firmly. And that was when I began to understand. They were not afraid of what the stones might reveal. They were afraid of what revelation would do to us. We reached a junction where the wall had been sealed, not with loose rubble, but with fitted slabs that had the calm, stubborn certainty of ancient engineering. The edges bore scratch marks, faint but undeniable, like someone had tried to pry the stones open long ago, or succeeded and then closed it again. "Someone has been here," I whispered before I could stop myself. A knight beside me didn't look comforted by that thought. He stared into the dark as if it stared back. Not someone, something. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what scribes do. I swallowed it. Hughes knelt at the seam. He ran his fingertips along the edge, feeling for a weakness, listening the way a mason listens to a wall. Then he nodded once, slow and certain. He gave the order to open it. No loud bows, no reckless force. This wasn't a siege, it was surgery. Two knights positioned a wedge. Another steadied the torch. An iron bar slid into a narrow gap. Their bodies shifted into the kind of stance you only learn from hard work. Knees bent, back straight, weight distributed so the stone doesn't win. They pried. The slab resisted at first, then gave with a sound that wasn't a crack, but a reluctant sigh. Dust spilled out in a thin curtain. The torch flame bent sideways as cold air pushed through the seam. And then, for the first time, the passage breathed. Not like wind, like a room that had been holding its breath for centuries and had finally been allowed to exhale. My own breath caught. The air that spilled out was dry and cold enough to sting the throat. It carried a smell I recognized instantly, even though it didn't belong underground. Old leather, ancient paper, the ghost of ink. The smell of a buried archive. In that moment, any childish dream of treasure died in me. Gold has a scent too. Metal, oil, human hands. This wasn't that. This was knowledge. The opening widened just enough for a man to slip through sideways. Hughes stopped the prying with a raised palm. He held the moment like a priest holds silence before a prayer. Then he lowered the torch to peer inside. The light revealed a narrow stair disappearing into deeper darkness. Hughes looked back at us, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen on the road or in court. Not fear, not excitement, recognition. As if he had been walking toward this door for years without admitting it. He turned to me. "Remember what you see, because what you write can be burned." I nodded, throat too tight for words. The scribe in me wanted parchment, wanted ink, wanted the safety of marks on a page. But the world we were entering didn't allow that kind of safety. We descended. The steps were narrow, the walls pressed close, moisture slicked the stone, and the air grew heavier the deeper we went. The torchlight made the passage feel like the inside of a throat, alive, constricting, swallowing. At a landing, I touched a wall to steady myself. The stone was colder than anything I'd felt above ground. It felt like winter trapped in rock. We moved again single file. The deeper we went, the older the masonry looked. The seams became tighter, the blocks more carefully set.
It was as if we were walking backward through time, passing from Crusader work to something that belonged to the land itself. At one point, the torchlight grazed a simple incision on the wall, an angular star-like mark worn by age. It wasn't decorative, it was placed. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped. Hughes didn't even need to look at me. His hand rose, and the tunnel returned to silence. We came to another blockage. This one partially collapsed, stones piled like broken teeth. The men shifted rubble carefully, piece by piece, making no more noise than necessary. Dust poured off the stones as they moved them, hanging in the torchlight like smoke. A narrow crawl space opened behind the collapse. The first knight dropped to his knees and crawled in. No armor, only cloth scraping stone. His torchlight shook as the passage tightened. He moved like a man forced to become smaller to survive. My turn came. I hesitated at the entrance, feeling the weight of earth above me. Then I lowered myself and crawled forward, elbows and knees dragging over stone, breath shallow. The torchlight ahead made the cramped space feel even smaller because it showed me every inch I had to pass through. And then, suddenly, it widened. We emerged into a pocket chamber, small but unmistakably untouched. Dust lay on ledges in layers so even they looked like skin. The torchlight swept across the walls and revealed faint etched lines, geometric in feel, worn but deliberate. In one niche we found something wrapped in brittle cloth. Not glowing, not magical, just old. But it sat there like a heartbeat waiting to be found. A knight reached toward it and hesitated as if his hand suddenly understood fragility. Then he lifted it with both palms and brought it into the torchlight. The cloth fibers crumbled slightly at the edge. Dust fell in slow trails. Hughes didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every man in that room felt the same shift. This was not the work of bandits or looters. This was a place where something had been kept. And if something had been kept, someone decided it was worth keeping. I pulled out a wax tablet instinctively, my hand moving before my mind could stop me. The stylus hovered. Then I froze. Hughes looked at me, not with anger, but with that calm certainty again. He gave the smallest nod towards my own head. Memorize. So I closed the tablet. I became what he wanted me to be. Not a writer, but a vessel. We did not unroll the bundle fully. We didn't need to. The smell alone told us enough. Leather, parchment, time, the faintest hint of ink. We rewrapped it, tied it carefully, and carried it out as if carrying a wounded man. We sealed the chamber again like we found it. We reset the stone. We brushed away marks. We moved through the tunnels like shadows returning to their place. Above ground, Jerusalem was still sleeping. No bells rang, no herald shouted, no chronicle recorded what we had done. And that, I realized, was the point. The silence was not accidental. It was built, like everything else we did. Because from that night onward, the Order was not simply a band of knights protecting roads. We had become keepers of a secret we could not safely explain. And I, the scribe who once believed history belonged to ink, began to understand the cruelest truth of all. Some chapters are written best in stone, in breath, and in memory, because the world above will always try to burn what it cannot control.
Time did something strange to us on the Temple Mount. Above ground, days still had names. Morning still arrived with pale light and the sound of gates opening. Pilgrims still gathered, trembling and hopeful, and we still rode out to meet them. We escorted caravans, tightened saddles, checked shields, and brought people safely back through Jerusalem's walls. To the world, we looked like what we claimed to be, defenders of the road. But beneath the surface, beneath the stone, time stopped behaving like a straight line. Nights blurred into one another. Dust became a calendar. The soot on our hands became a kind of clock. Our lives were measured not in feasts or holy days, but in how deep we went, how far we mapped, and how little we spoke. There's a point where secrecy stops being a choice and becomes a condition of breathing. That was where we lived. I learned to hate paper, not because writing was wrong, but because writing was dangerous.
A page can be stolen. A page can be copied. A page can be dragged into court and turned into a noose. So I started training my memory the way a soldier trains his body. I repeated corridors in my mind until they became muscle. I turned symbols into prayers and prayers into codes. I learned to look at a mark once, then carry it inside me without needing to trace it again. When I did write, I wrote like a man hiding poison in honey, ordinary words with secret meanings, references buried inside scripture, locations disguised as verses. And even then, I often burned what I wrote, watching the ash curl into nothing, because nothing is harder to interrogate than smoke. During the day, the public face of the order grew stronger. Pilgrims came in greater numbers. Nobles brought gifts. Men talked about us in taverns and market lanes, some with gratitude, some with envy. And envy in Jerusalem is never far from suspicion. We patrolled the roads with disciplined speed. When bandits struck, we ended fights quickly. No theatrics, no needless cruelty. One clean block, one decisive answer. Then back into formation, back into duty. And yet, even on the surface, I could feel the shift in us. The men returned from underground differently. Their eyes held weight. Their voices grew rarer. Their laughter, already scarce, became something that happened only when someone was forcing it. At night, we descended again. The Temple Mount swallowed us the way it always did. Narrow stairwells, damp air, torchlight shaking on wet limestone. The deeper we went, the older the stones looked. Some joints were so tightly fitted they seemed to deny the very idea of time. The walls carried faint scratches and grooves, not decorative, measuring marks, alignment marks, work done by hands that cared about precision. It wasn't magic, it was method. And method can be more unsettling than myth, because method suggests intention. One night, we found a chamber that looked different from the rest. The walls were darkened, as if smoke had licked them long ago. The air felt stale, pressed flat. The torchlight pooled in the center and refused to brighten the corners. On the floor was a rectangular groove, clean and deliberate, like the outline of a chest that once rested there. The chest itself was gone, but the stone remembered its weight. I knelt and traced the groove with my fingertips. Dust gathered under my nails. At the edge of the outline there were drag marks, parallel scratches leading away, fading into darkness. I said, "Someone moved something," and immediately wished I hadn't. The knight beside me didn't look comforted. He stared toward the shadows at the far end of the chamber like a man listening to a sound that only he could hear. "Not someone," he said, almost to himself. My throat tightened. I didn't ask what he meant. Some questions are traps. Hugh stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't order men to tear the room apart. He did what he always did when the unknown leaned too close. He imposed discipline. He raised his torch, scanned the soot patterns, then signaled for silence. We stood there, all of us, breathing quietly, listening. The chamber didn't answer, but something in the air felt wrong. Not supernatural, just wrong in the way a cellar can feel wrong when you know there's a draft that shouldn't exist, or when your body realizes a space is more open than your eyes can see. In that moment, I understood a hard truth about men like Hughes. They weren't afraid of danger. They were afraid of uncontrolled danger. Danger that could turn into rumor. Rumor that could turn into accusation. Accusation that could turn into fire. And somewhere in the dark beneath the Temple Mount, the first sparks of that conflict were already waiting. Hughes brought me into a small stone room. An oil lamp smoked in the corner, making the walls sweat shadow. A locked chest sat in the background like a silent witness. He asked me a question I didn't expect. "What do you believe in?" My answer rose out of habit, out of years of training in monasteries. "In God." Hughes nodded slowly. Then he said something that chilled me more than any underground draft. "I do too, but I'm not sure Rome understands God the same way." He didn't say it like a rebel. He said it like a man stating weather. And that was the moment I began to understand the true danger of what we were doing. Not because we were chasing treasure, but because we were becoming an organization that could not be fully contained by the stories other people wanted to tell. So, we adapted. We built codes into scripture references. We replaced names with saints' names. We replaced places with fragments of psalms. Under the ground became in the belly of the fish. The changer became the second altar. Ordinary phrases became keys. I learned, painfully, how not to write. I learned to burn pages before anyone could take them. I learned to carry truth in breath and silence. Above ground, we trained like soldiers. Below ground, we worked like scholars. And between those two lives, our order began to split without anyone noticing. There were the public brothers, the visible ones, guarding pilgrims, drilling in courtyards, wearing the cross like a banner. And then there were the others, the ones who disappeared at night, who measured stones, who listened to drafts, who returned with dust in their hair and a different kind of weight in their eyes. Time passed that way, not in months, not in years, but in repeated descents. Some mornings I would stand on a terrace at sunrise, look over Jerusalem and feel like the world above was moving in one direction, while the world below pulled us in another. The strangest part was how normal the surface became. Men laughed in corridors. Outer knights joked in the courtyard. Pilgrims still thanked us with trembling hands. And meanwhile, a coded glance here, a quick tap of fingers on a belt buckle there, a quiet bundle hidden under a plank, these became our real language. Eventually, we began to descend deeper than before. The torchlight felt smaller. The stone felt older. The darkness ahead felt less like night and more like depth itself, a black that swallowed sound. In those moments, I wasn't thinking of glory or theology. I was thinking of survival. Because the deeper we went, the clearer it became. Even if we never found another chamber, even if we never lifted another stone, we had already changed. We had learned what it meant to guard something without being able to name it publicly. We had learned how fragile truth becomes once it enters the world of politics and power. And as I followed Hughes down those steps again, with the torchlight shrinking behind us, I realized something that made my stomach turn. We weren't just digging through stone. We were digging toward a conflict that didn't have a battlefield. A conflict fought with whispers, with documents, with accusations, with fire. And somewhere in the dark beneath the Temple Mount, the first sparks of that conflict were already waiting.
There was a moment when I understood something that changed the way I looked at everything we were doing. Not in a flash of revelation, not in a thunderbolt of faith, but in a cold corridor under the Temple Mount, when my fingers touched marks in stone that were too clean, too evenly spaced, too deliberate to be random. They weren't decorations, they were measurements. We had descended again, as we did so many nights. Torchlight shivered across damp limestone. The air tasted like wet rock and smoke. Every sound was small. Boots scuffing, cloth brushing stone, the slow breathing of men trying not to make noise. The passage narrowed until our shoulders almost touched the walls, and then the torchlight revealed the grooves. A sequence of cuts, evenly spaced, carved with a certainty that didn't belong to Crusader hands. They ran along the wall like the tick marks on a ruler. I slid my palm across them and felt the rhythm, the repetition. It was the kind of pattern a builder makes when he wants the next builder to understand him. Hughes knelt beside the wall, not like a worshiper, but like a man studying a map. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked, then felt the stone, and finally pulled out the wooden measuring rod we kept hidden in our supplies. He held it against the grooves as if testing a memory. And that's when I realized the unsettling truth. Someone had built this place to be read. Further down, the corridor ended in something stranger. A rectangular stone feature. A small round hole cut into it, worn smooth at the edges, as if something had turned there many times, like a pivot.
I leaned closer, and the torchlight caught the wear pattern, the subtle polish that only use can create. It wasn't a symbol, it wasn't a relic, it was a mechanism. Hughes pointed at it, then glanced at me. The message was clear even without words. This wasn't a legend, this was engineering. One knight laid twine across the floor, pulling it taut from the pivot point toward the axis of the corridor. Another held the torch low, so the flame wouldn't dance too wildly. The twine cut a straight line through dust, and for a moment the whole chamber felt like a workshop instead of a tomb. Hughes stepped back and looked at it all, the grooves, the pivot, the line, and gave a single, slow nod. We weren't just uncovering chambers, we were uncovering a system. That night, when we emerged back into the world above, I walked out onto a terrace and stared into the sky over Jerusalem. The stars looked sharp and cold, like they had been hammered into place. I remembered the few scraps of astronomy I had learned in my youth, how sailors used stars to keep their course, how seasons shifted, how the heavens followed patterns no king could change. And suddenly, I saw why this mattered. If someone built this underground space with measurement and alignment in mind, then it meant the holy feeling of the Temple Mount might not have been only prayer and tradition. It might have been architecture, geometry, timing, stone placed where it needed to be so light and shadow would behave in a certain way. Not magic, but mastery. And mastery is dangerous in the wrong hands. That is what Hughes understood better than anyone. Back in our quarters, Hughes set the measuring rod beside a psalter and tapped 2 points on the wood, then 2 points on the page. It was a lesson in code, yes, but it was also a lesson in survival. A system that can be measured can be repeated. A secret that can be repeated can be stolen. That's why he insisted we become careful. That's why he warned me again and again, write less, remember more. He said, paper burns, and the world loves to burn paper. So I learned to hold knowledge in my body, in breath, in silence. I practiced memorizing with the same discipline knights used in training. I would stare at a wall and replay the corridor in my mind until I could walk it with my eyes closed. I would trace patterns in dust with a fingertip, then wipe them away, leaving nothing behind. I would make a note on wax and then smear it smooth again, as if my own hand could erase the temptation to record too much. Even our work underground became quieter. We measured more than we pried. We listened more than we spoke. Sometimes we would stop completely, simply to feel the air. There were moments when the torch flame bent sideways in a cold draft, warning us that a hidden void was near. There were notches in stone, reference marks under dust, tiny clues that told us this place had once been part of a larger plan. And then there were the symbols. A simple star-like incision on a wall, worn and old. Not shining, not supernatural, just there, stubborn and patient. Hughes would always stop us from touching such marks, not because he feared the mark itself, but because he feared what touching it might mean. Because once you start treating stone like scripture, you begin to believe the world is speaking to you directly. And belief, unchecked belief, can make a man dangerous. That was Hughes' great strength. He could stand in the shadow of mystery without drowning in it. He never spoke about overthrowing the church. He never talked like a rebel. He talked like a guardian. One night, deep underground, we rested in a chamber where torches were fixed in sconces, and the air was thick with smoke. Men sat against stone, exhausted, swallowing water from leather flasks. Their faces were streaked with soot. Their eyes were sharp with fatigue. Hughes stood over us, and with a simple gesture, fist closed, then palm open, he made our purpose clear. Guard, not use. Keep, not exploit. The secret wasn't meant to make us kings. It was meant to keep us from becoming monsters. And that is where my understanding finally settled. People always ask, what did the Templars find? They expect an object, a treasure, a relic. But the truth is, the most valuable thing we found wasn't a thing. It was a way of seeing. We began to recognize that power doesn't only sit on thrones. It sits in systems, in measurements, in the ability to organize men, stone, and belief into something that feels inevitable. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That knowledge changed the way we built, the way we planned, the way we moved in the world. Even our public duties, escorting pilgrims, guarding roads, became part of a larger structure, a visible mission covering an invisible one. We kept working as if normal. We greeted nobles, we prayed in chapels, we carried ourselves like obedient servants of God. But beneath those gestures, something quieter grew, discipline of information. When a symbol appeared, we noted it in memory, not on paper. When a measurement mattered, we coded it into scripture references. When a chamber revealed itself, we resealed it as if we had never been there. In time, we stopped being a group of knights who dug in secret. We became a network of men trained to carry secrets without leaving tracks. The measuring rod became more than a tool. It became a reminder that the world can be read. The torch became more than light. It became a warning. Even the smallest flame can reveal too much. And I, the scribe, became something I never imagined I could be, a living archive. Not because I wanted power, but because once you have seen what we saw, once you have felt the precision carved into stone under the holiest ground in Jerusalem, you understand that knowledge, in the wrong hands, doesn't liberate, it dominates. That's why Hughes did what he did. That's why he kept his voice low and his orders simple. That's why he drilled discipline into us harder than any sword training. Because he wasn't preparing us for a battle with bandits. He was preparing us for the kind of war that doesn't use blades first. The kind that begins with whispers, with documents, with accusations, with someone deciding that the only safe secret is the one they control. At the end of a long night, as we returned to the surface, Hughes paused at the measured grooves one last time. I saw him look at the marks as if weighing something. Then he moved on, leaving them behind. I touched the stone lightly as I passed, tracing one groove with my fingertip. Dust lifted and clung to my skin. I left a clean streak behind, like a line on a page. A draft of memory. And then a faint draft of air moved through the corridor and softened it, blurring my mark. The stone, in its own way, erased me. That felt like a warning. Back in our quarters, Hughes locked the chest with the bundle we had recovered, the one that smelled of leather and old ink. The key turned with resistance. The latch clicked. And I did something small and private. I wrote a single line on a scrap. Not a confession, not an explanation, more like a promise. I folded it tight and hid it in the seam of my belt pouch. Not for anyone else to find. For me, in case fear ever made me forget who I was. Because by then, I knew the truth that would shape the rest of my life. We were no longer guarding roads. We were guarding memory. And memory, once it becomes valuable, is always hunted.
The first time I understood what it meant to survive a secret, it wasn't underground. It was when we decided to leave Jerusalem. Above the Temple Mount, the city still looked the same. Limestone walls catching the sun, banners moving in dry wind, pilgrims gathering with tired eyes and stubborn faith. But inside our quarters, the air had changed. There was a quiet urgency in the way men folded cloth, checked straps, and avoided speaking unless they had to. Hugues de Payens didn't announce our departure like a commander chasing applause. He simply gave orders the way a man gives instructions before a storm, calm, precise, and without explaining more than necessary. We weren't leaving because the mission was finished. We were leaving because a mission like ours could not survive without protection. And in our world, protection came in the form of parchment. If Jerusalem was the place where we found the door, Europe was the place where we needed permission to exist. So we moved toward the coast under a hard sun, riding in disciplined silence. The land outside the city was all rock and scrub, the road rough under hooves. By the time we reached the port, salt wind and sea mist coated everything, Cloaks, rope, skin, even thoughts. Ships in those days weren't graceful. They were stubborn wooden bodies that creaked and groaned and smelled of tar, wet rope, and old fish. We loaded chests and bundles with care, using rope slings and pulleys, because even a small mistake could split a plank, or worse, split a secret. On deck, I gripped the railing as the sea rocked beneath us. My stomach turned, but I didn't complain. I watched the way sailors moved, feet wide for balance, hands always ready to catch a shifting load. The ocean taught the same lesson Hugh did. Weight is real, momentum is real, and if you pretend otherwise, you die. At night, the water was black, and the sky was sharp with stars. Lantern light made small trembling islands on the deck. Hugh stood at the bow, cloak snapping in the wind, looking ahead as if the horizon owed him answers. Below deck, in the cramped space where the timber ribs pressed close, I did what I always did. I organized, I hid, I prepared. I slid a small wooden token between pages of my psalter, the way others would hide a knife. Not because I wanted drama, but because I was learning something new about faith. A holy book could also be a lockbox. When we reached Europe, the air itself felt different, wetter, heavier, full of soil and smoke instead of dust and sun. We traveled through countryside that seemed almost gentle compared to the Holy Land. Rolling fields, hedgerows, small villages with Romanesque towers rising like stone prayers. But Europe had its own dangers. In Jerusalem, danger came from blades on the road. In Europe, danger came from questions. We stopped at monasteries, where silent men in plain habits moved like shadows through whitewashed corridors. In their writing rooms, quills scratched parchment all day long, ink dried under sand, wax seals cooled in neat rows. It was peaceful, and it terrified me, because that calm meant control. Here, words were not just words, they were chains, they were weapons, they were permission. That was when I truly understood why Hugh had warned me about writing. Not because writing was sinful, but because writing was powerful, and power always attracts hands that want to own it. When we reached Troy in the cold season, when the air bit at the skin and breath hung visible like smoke, the town buzzed with arrivals, bishops, abbots, clerks, attendants. Ecclesiastical banners moved above the crowd. The stones of the council hall looked ancient and indifferent, as if they had seen 1,000 decisions and never cared about any of them. Inside, candlelight and murmurs filled the space. I stood at the edge, where scribes and observers belong, and watched men in robes debate the shape of our lives. This was the part of the story people misunderstand. They imagine the Templars were forged in battle alone. But the truth is, we were forged in rooms like this, rooms where the sharpest weapons were seals and signatures. Bernard of Clairvaux was there, a Cistercian abbot with eyes that looked like they could strip lies from a man without raising his voice. He didn't ask the question I feared most. He didn't ask what we had done beneath the Temple Mount. He asked something simpler. He asked whether we would obey. And that was the moment I felt the trap snap shut, quietly. Because obedience is how institutions hold power. If the church could define us, it could claim us. If it could claim us, it could contain us. And if it could contain us, it could decide what parts of our story were allowed to exist. Hugh stood before them, without armor, without ornament, speaking with the calm of a man who had already chosen his path. He asked for recognition, for rule, for the right to exist as a brotherhood with purpose. And the church gave it. In the year 1129, the council at Troy made us official. It should have felt like victory, but I remember watching the wax seals pressed into place, watching parchment rolls tied and set aside, and feeling something colder than pride. Because I knew what Hugh knew. Paper privileges can be blessings, but they can also be leashes. When they presented the white mantle,
It looked innocent, pure wool, plain, heavy on the arms. Men in the hall saw it as holiness made visible. Hugh lifted it with both hands, let it settle onto his shoulders, and stood very still. He didn't smile. He wore it like a mask, because from that moment on, the mantle would do two things at once. It would protect us in public, and it would make us easier to watch. That night, after the hall emptied and the candles burned lower, Hugh called me into a smaller room. Rain tapped at shutters. The oil lamp smoked and made the walls sweat shadow. He didn't give me a speech. He gave me a lesson. He opened my psalter and placed a token on a verse. Then he moved the token to another verse. He showed me how a line of scripture could become a location, how a saint's name could replace a living name, how the belly of the fish could mean a place beneath stone. He taught me how to write without writing, how to communicate without leaving a trail a king could follow. From now on, he said, you don't record what matters, you carry it. I realized then what my role had become. I wasn't simply the man who kept accounts. I was becoming a vessel, someone trained to hold dangerous knowledge inside a body, not on parchment. We left Troy under a gray sky, riding out past fields rimed with cold. Behind us, the council hall stood solid and quiet, its documents already traveling into archives that would outlive most of us. Ahead of us, Europe stretched wide. Kingdoms, borders, monasteries, ports, and roads. And in that vastness, our order began to grow. Not only as knights, but as a system, a network that could move men, money, messages, and, when necessary, secrets. As we rode, my white mantle flapped in the wind, heavy with rain. The red cross stood out against it like a promise and a warning. And I understood something that would haunt me for years afterwards. Once you are written into official history, you are no longer just living a mission, you are becoming a target. Because power always notices what it cannot fully control. And the moment we accepted the church's protection, we stepped into a larger game. One where the battlefield was not a road outside Jerusalem, but the very machinery of Europe itself.
By the time Europe learned our name, the order was no longer a handful of men. It had become a network. From the outside, it looked simple enough. White mantles, red crosses, disciplined knights riding the roads. But if you stepped inside one of our commanderies, if you stood in the courtyard at dawn and listened, you could hear the truth in the rhythm of the place. A commandery was not just a fortress, it was a machine. Stone walls held back threats, yes, but they also held inventories. Stables held horses, but they also held schedules. Granaries held grain, but they also held leverage. Chapels held prayer, but they also held discipline. And at the center of that machine was a thing most people didn't think about at all: paperwork. I watched it grow from the inside. I was a scribe. That meant I lived among ledgers, seals, and locks. My days were measured in wax and ink, in lists of wheat and barrels of wine, in the weight of coin and the count of horses. It was not glamorous work, but it was the kind of work that quietly moves kingdoms. On a cold morning in rural France, I stepped into a commandery courtyard where the mist still clung to the stones. A banner with a simple cross snapped in the wind above the gatehouse. Men were already working, some. By the time Europe learned our name, the order was no longer a handful of men. It had become a network. From the outside, it looked simple enough. White mantles, red crosses, disciplined knights riding the roads. But if you stepped inside one of our commanderies, if you stood in the courtyard at dawn and listened, you could hear the truth in the rhythm of the place. A commandery was not just a fortress, it was a machine. Stone walls held back threats, yes, but they also held inventories. Stables held horses, but they also held schedules. Granaries held grain, but they also held leverage. Chapels held prayer, but they also held discipline.
And at the center of that machine was a thing most people didn't think about at all: paperwork. I watched it grow from the inside. I was a scribe. That meant I lived among ledgers, seals, and locks. My days were measured in wax and ink, in lists of wheat and barrels of wine, in the weight of coin and the count of horses. It was not glamorous work, but it was the kind of work that quietly moves kingdoms. On a cold morning in rural France, I stepped into a commandery courtyard where the mist still clung to the stones. A banner with a simple cross snapped in the wind above the gatehouse. Men were already working, some saddling horses, some unloading grain, some stacking firewood. And I realized, with a kind of uneasy pride, that our strength wasn't only in swords, it was in systems. A farmer's wagon arrived with sacks of grain. The sacks were weighed, counted, poured into bins, and recorded. A horse was brought in, inspected, assigned, and recorded. A messenger arrived with a sealed letter, delivered it, and left with another sealed letter. Everything had a place. Everything had a record. And once something has a record, it can be managed, multiplied, protected. That is how power spreads, not always by conquest, but by organization. The world began to notice. Nobles came to us not just for escorts, but for security. They didn't trust the roads. They didn't trust rival lords. They didn't even trust their own servants. But they trusted a sealed document in our hand and a chest behind our walls. That trust became a kind of currency. A man could leave his money with us in one city and retrieve its value in another. He didn't have to carry gold across bandit roads. He carried a promise instead, a written pledge, a seal, a code known to our brothers. People later called it banking, as if it were a clever invention. From where I sat, it was something more basic, a solution to fear. And fear is always profitable. I remember sitting at a table by candlelight, sliding coins onto a balance scale. The beam tilted, oscillated once, then settled. I watched that slow moment of settling and thought, this is what the world wants: stability, a place where weight becomes certainty. Outside our walls, kings fought for land. Inside, we weighed certainty. But the very privileges that allowed us to function also planted resentment. We answered directly to the Pope. In many places, we were exempt from local taxes. Bishops couldn't simply command us. Lords couldn't easily squeeze us. To common people, it looked like holiness. To many rulers, it looked like an insult. There were times on the road when I saw it plainly. A local toll guard would stand beside a bridge, hand hovering near the coin box, watching our riders pass without paying. He wouldn't dare stop us, but his fist would clench around nothing, and his eyes would burn with the kind of anger that waits patiently for permission. And that's what resentment does. It waits. Our order grew across borders: France, England, and Iberia. Riders moved between commanderies like blood through veins. Messages traveled faster than most lords could comprehend. We could move grain from one region to another, coin from one city to another, men from one frontier to another. The result was a web of influence that didn't depend on any single throne. That made us useful, and it made us dangerous. People also began to notice our buildings. Templar chapels often took on a distinct shape, especially round churches, inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. They felt different to people. A circle is a strange thing in a medieval world full of rectangles and narrow naves. A circle gathers sound. A circle gathers attention. A circle makes a space feel held. I once watched a simple farmer step into one of our chapels and fall silent. He had no Latin, no theology. He couldn't read, but he felt something. And when he left, he didn't know why he felt calmer, only that he did. That is the hidden power of architecture. It speaks in a language the illiterate still understand. Was it secret geometry? People love to say that because it makes the story glitter. From my view, the truth was less mystical and more practical. We had learned that proportion, light, and shape can guide the human mind. A well-built space can make people steady. A steady person is easier to lead, easier to protect, easier to unify. Even the act of building became a kind of message, not a message written in ink, but in stone, harder to burn, harder to confiscate. At the same time, our martial life never stopped. We still trained in dust-filled yards, shields slamming into wooden posts, strikes coming with controlled force. We still escorted pilgrims, scanning ridgelines, tightening formation when the road narrowed. When bandits attacked, we ended fights quickly. One clean block, one decisive strike, then silence again. No flourish, no excess. Because a knight who loves violence is a liability. A knight who treats violence as a tool is an instrument, and instruments can be directed. As our network grew, so did the quiet fear around it. Some priests muttered that we were too secretive. Some nobles complained that we were too rich. Some kings resented that we were too independent. Some people whispered about what happened behind closed doors, simply because they couldn't stand not knowing. And that's how myth starts, not from evidence, but from distance. Meanwhile, inside our walls, we kept doing what we had always done: counting, sealing, moving, protecting. I sat night after night in the counting room, pushing wooden counters across a board to calculate totals. I sealed letters with wax and tied them with cord. I watched messengers tighten satchel straps and ride out into fog. And sometimes, when the candlelight was low and the building was quiet, I would stop and realize what we had become. Not just knights, not just monks, planners, guardians. A system strong enough that even the church hesitated, because the church understood something too. Power that grows too quickly becomes a rival, even if it wears the right symbols. There was a cold irony in that. The papacy had granted us protection, and by granting it, had helped create an organization it could not easily control. The kings had tolerated us because we were useful, and by tolerating us, they had allowed us to grow beyond their reach. And we, outwardly humble, kept building, we kept lending, we kept moving, we kept expanding. In time, the web of our commanderies spread like roots beneath the surface of Europe. A rider could travel from one house of the order to the next and never be truly alone. A noble could deposit wealth in one kingdom and retrieve its value in another. He didn't have to carry gold across bandit roads. He carried a promise instead, a written pledge, a seal, a code known to our brothers. People later called it banking, as if it were a clever invention. From where I sat, it was something more basic, a solution to fear. And fear is always profitable. I remember sitting at a table by candlelight, sliding coins onto a balance scale. The beam tilted, oscillated once, then settled. I watched that slow moment of settling and thought, this is what the world wants: stability, a place where weight becomes certainty. Outside our walls, kings.
There are things you can hide in a chest. Gold, letters, a relic wrapped in cloth. But the longer I lived among the Templars, the more I understood our true method. We hid our most important knowledge somewhere no fire could easily reach. We hid it in stone. I learned that lesson in a small round chapel at dawn, somewhere in rural France, where the mist still clung to the fields and the grass glittered with cold. The chapel was Romanesque. Thick walls, narrow windows, a door that creaked like an old confession. Inside, candlelight pooled in warm circles. The air held a faint taste of incense and smoke, the way it always does when people have been praying there for generations. The stone curves made every sound feel contained, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I stepped in quietly, and for a moment I did nothing but listen. That's how you begin to understand a place like this. Not by staring, not by measuring immediately, but by letting it work on you. A peasant came in after me. Rough wool clothes, dirt under his nails, eyes tired. He didn't know Latin, he couldn't read, but the moment he crossed the threshold, something changed in his posture. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the world had stopped shouting at him. He looked up at the curve of the ceiling and fell silent. Watching him, I felt a strange chill, because he didn't need doctrine to feel what the space was doing. The chapel guided him without words. It gathered his attention, steadied his breath, and made his mind quieter. That's when I realized the truth. Architecture can teach. It can persuade. It can calm. It can intimidate. It can make a man believe he is standing inside something greater than himself. And once you understand that, you begin to understand why our order built the way it did. In the commandery workshops, I watched masons work like surgeons. Their tools were simple: compasses, straight edges, plumb lines, twine. But in their hands, those tools became a language. A master mason would open a compass to a certain span, draw a smooth arc, then stop. A string line would be pulled taut across a board and leave a faint track in dust when lifted away. A stone template would be measured, then measured again, not out of superstition, but out of obsession with correctness. Nothing floated, nothing bent reality. The work obeyed weight and friction and gravity. A rope creaked, a block rose only as fast as men could pull. Dust fell where it was disturbed. It was all real, and that made it more unsettling, because it meant the mystery people felt in our buildings wasn't coming from magic. It was coming from craft so precise that it shaped human emotion. I traveled with the order as it expanded. France, England, Iberia. I saw chapels rise from earth like careful thoughts. I watched stone circles take shape, scaffolding wrapped around them like ribs. I watched sunlight strike a corner or a window slit at a specific moment of day, turning an ordinary wall into a bright line like a blade. And slowly, I began to think of our buildings the way a musician thinks of a song. Not because the stones made literal music, but because every proportion, every curve, every placement of light felt intentional, like notes placed in the right order to produce a specific effect. In England, I walked through a partially built round church and ran my hand close to the wall without touching it, as if my palm could feel the geometry. Dust hung in beams of light. The place smelled of limestone chips and wet rope. A pulley wheel squealed softly. A stone block rose a few inches then stopped as workers braced their legs and steadied it. No one moved like a hero. They moved like laborers, like builders. And I thought, this is how secrets survive. Not as a story told aloud, but as a technique passed from hand to hand. Later, in Portugal, I stood at Tomar as the fortress and church rose above olive groves. The landscape was bright and dry, the wind sharp. From the ramparts, you could see for miles. Inside the round church space, shafts of light cut through dust like spears. I walked the perimeter, counting steps silently, stopping at a column as if I were placing an invisible marker in my mind. I wasn't doing it because someone told me to. I was doing it because the habit had grown into me. Memory in our order was a discipline. We didn't always write things down, not the important things, not the things that could be used against us. Instead, we learned to store them in the mind, in pattern, in repeated practice. Sometimes I would sketch a floor plan by candlelight and then smudge it with my thumb, breaking the clarity on purpose. Sometimes I would draw a line in dust on a tabletop to understand it, then wipe it away until there was nothing left to accuse. And yet, the chapel itself remained, a record too large to burn. People began to talk, of course. They always do. In capital towns, you could feel the legend forming at the edges of conversation. Someone would point at a building and whisper that an unseen order had guided its design. Someone would swear the stone held messages. Someone would claim the Templars knew things they shouldn't. Most of it was exaggeration, but it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the simple fact that we had money, organization, and the ability to move skilled labor across borders. Even without hidden knowledge, that alone could leave fingerprints on stone.
And then there were places like the great cathedrals, where the floor held labyrinth patterns and colored light spilled from stained glass like a living thing. I walked one labyrinth slowly, boot following the worn line in stone, and felt how the path itself forced a kind of meditation. A person couldn't rush in a labyrinth. The pattern made you slow down. The pattern made you think. That, too, is a kind of power. In a crypt beneath one such cathedral, I knelt near a water basin fed by a faint spring. Torchlight rippled on the water. A droplet fell and sent rings outward. I watched those rings and thought, history is like this. A small disturbance in one place spreads farther than anyone expects. Back at our commanderies, I divided documents into piles. Public accounts, private notes. Public ledgers were clean and acceptable. Private sketches were coded, hidden, locked away. A key turned in a small iron box lock with resistance and a click, and the box vanished under a floor plank or behind a false panel. Even our rituals were careful. At night, in a chapel lit only by a few candles, a brother might hum a low tone just to hear how the space responded. Not superstition, curiosity. The way sound lived in the curve of stone. The way a building could feel like an instrument. I remember placing a small pebble on a ledge and watching it shift almost imperceptibly, not from magic, but from vibration. Then stopping it with my fingertip, reminding myself again, these forces are real. Small, but real. And that is why they are dangerous, because people will take what they don't understand and make it into a weapon, or a myth, or an accusation. As rumors grew, we learned to manage appearances. We reduced candles at certain altars. We drew curtains. We kept symbols in shadow when light would have been safer for devotion, but more dangerous for politics. We continued to escort pilgrims. We continued to fight when we had to. I saw ambushes on wet forest roads, shields striking with a hard, controlled impact, boots sliding on leaf litter and regaining balance. Every movement was bound by weight and consequence. And still, in quiet moments, my mind returned to stone, to the idea that the most enduring messages are not written on paper, they're carved into space. One dawn, I stood outside a chapel as a sunbeam struck a narrow window and landed on a particular spot on the floor, like a precise finger pointing. I didn't step into the light, I stepped aside, almost instinctively, as if disturbing it would break the spell. And I thought, someone planned this. Someone built a moment into the day. Not for spectacle, for memory. That is what our buildings became over time. Memory made physical. To the untrained eye, they were simply chapels and towers and walls. To us, they were a language, a way to carry ideas forward through centuries without leaving a page that could be seized, a way to hide truth in plain sight. Because the world can burn libraries, but it cannot easily burn a cathedral, and it cannot interrogate a curve of stone into confessing what it means. That's why when I look back now, I don't think of our legacy as treasure buried in a vault. I think of it as a score written into architecture, played by light, echoed by sound, and read by anyone who knows how to listen. And as I walked away from a round chapel one night, mist drifting across the yard and banners stirring overhead, I turned back once more and looked at the building, not as a house of worship, as a message. Then I pulled my cloak tight and disappeared into the shadows, carrying the rest of the story where it belonged, inside the silence.
On the front lines of the Holy Land, you learn a truth no sermon can teach. Sometimes your enemy speaks a language you recognize. Not French, not Latin, not Arabic. A quieter language, made of restraint, caution, and the simple instinct to survive one more day. People remember the Templars as men of steel, as if we lived only to clash with swords. But war, especially long war, does something to a man. It sharpens him, yes. It also forces him to notice what violence cannot solve. Some days you live because you know when not to strike. Some days you live because you know how to speak without giving away your throat. I learned that at the edge of a battlefield, during a prisoner exchange outside a fort, where the ground was flat, dusty, and tense enough to cut. We approached slowly, weapons lowered but not forgotten,
Our banners hung in the wind like warnings. The other side came the same way. In that space between us, every footstep sounded louder than it should. Every hand movement felt like a decision. Captives were guided forward, not shoved. No one wanted a spark that would turn diplomacy into slaughter. You could feel it in the way men held their shoulders, rigid, ready, but controlled. And then I saw him. An old man in plain robes, no armor, no blade. He wasn't part of the armed line. He stood slightly apart, like someone who belonged to a different war entirely. His clothing was simple. His posture was calm. His eyes were the kind that had learned to look beyond flags. Our interpreter whispered that he was a Sufi, one of the mystics of Islam, a seeker who spoke of God not as a banner, but as a path. I didn't know enough to judge the label, but I knew this. When he looked at us, he wasn't looking at enemies. He was looking at men. He stepped forward slowly with open hands. The wind tugged at his sleeves. Dust moved around his feet. He stopped at a respectful distance from Hughes, and he spoke in a tone that didn't demand anything. I couldn't understand the words, but I could read the shape of the moment. This was not a challenge. It was a question. Hughes answered as he always did, carefully. He offered the surface truth, the truth anyone could hear. "We guard the road," he said, through the interpreter. The old man listened, nodding as if he accepted the answer, but his eyes didn't change. He studied Hughes like a monk studying a rival monk, not for weakness, but for recognition. Then he asked another question. This time the interpreter hesitated before translating, as if the words carried weight. "What do you guard, truly?" the old man said. One of our knights gave the official answer again. "Pilgrims, roads, duty." The old man nodded, then said something quietly that the interpreter delivered with a frown, like he didn't want to repeat it. "Those who guard the road often guard a door." The air tightened. I felt it. The knights felt it. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift, snorting softly, shifting hooves in the dust. Because that word, door, was not a metaphor to us. We lived on a door. We slept above one. We had descended through it into darkness beneath the Temple Mount. And here was a man standing at the edge of a truce, speaking as if he had placed his hand on the same stone. Hughes didn't flinch. He didn't show surprise, but I watched his hand on his sword hilt loosen just slightly. Not to surrender, to signal restraint. The Sufi's gaze moved to the red cross on our mantles. He didn't sneer at it. He didn't fear it. He looked at it like a symbol with layers. He spoke again, calmly. The interpreter translated in fragments, words about guardianship, about silence, about how divine knowledge is not always the property of one faith. The old man wasn't praising us. He was acknowledging something more unsettling, that both sides understood the weight of secrets. People like to imagine the Crusades as pure hatred, pure certainty, pure separation. But in moments like that, on the dusty line between two armed groups, you see the truth. Certainty is often performance. Underneath, there's a shared fear of chaos. The exchange continued. Captives crossed the line. Tokens of truce passed hand to hand. A cup of water was offered, carefully, as if the water itself could be weaponized. The old man drank slowly and lowered the cup with steady hands. He looked at Hughes once more, as if sealing a private understanding without writing it down. Then the line broke apart. Both sides stepped back. Weapons rose again, not in attack, but in readiness. And the old man walked away. Not in triumph, not in defeat, just away. That night, back in camp, the men cleaned beer in silence. Blades were wiped, waterskins were passed, boots were checked for stones. The fire cracked and sent sparks into the dark. I sat with my wax tablet and stylus in my hands, ready to record what I had witnessed. And then I stopped, because the moment was too sharp to put into words safely. Not because it was miraculous, but because it would be misunderstood. If I wrote that a Sufi had spoken to us about doors and guardianship, some would claim we were negotiating heresy. Others would claim we were learning forbidden wisdom. Others would twist it into propaganda. So I smoothed the wax back to blank. I chose memory over ink. In the days that followed, the war returned to its normal rhythm. Escort patrols, ambushes, quick fights ended with discipline. Shields collided with a hard, controlled impact. Boots slipped on gravel and corrected. Dust rose and settled. The physics of violence never lied, even when men did. And yet, the old man's words stayed with me, because they forced a dangerous thought. What if what we guarded beneath the Temple Mount was not purely Christian, not purely Jewish, not purely Islamic, but something older, something all sides could sense without agreeing on its meaning? I didn't romanticize it. I had seen cruelty. I had seen bodies in the road. I knew mercy was rare. But I also knew this. At the edges of war, men sometimes recognize one another as fellow prisoners of history. Later, when I returned to Jerusalem and stood near the Temple Mount again, the stone steps looked unchanged. The arches still held the night wind. The banners still moved. The city still breathed its layered sounds. But inside me, the word door had a new weight. A door is not only something you pass through, it is something you defend, something you hide, something you control. And when you control a door, you control what the world is allowed to see. That's why I believe the most dangerous battles are not always fought with swords. They are fought over access, over who gets to enter the room where meaning is kept, over who gets to decide what is sacred and what is forbidden. So when I followed Hughes down into the darkness again, torchlight shrinking behind us, ancient stone closing around our shoulders, I understood that our war had more than one front. There was the visible war, fought on roads and ridgelines, and there was the hidden war, fought in tunnels, in symbols, in silence. A war where a single word spoken in the wrong place could become a weapon. The old Sufi had named it without naming it. We were guardians of a door, and the world, whether it was Rome, Jerusalem, or the desert beyond, was always full of men who wanted that door opened on their terms.
I first met the Black Madonna in a chapel so small it could have been overlooked by anyone who wasn't looking for patterns. It was in the south of France, near one of our commanderies. Romanesque stone, thick walls, a low doorway that kept the outside world from rushing in. The air inside smelled of wax and old smoke, the kind of smell that tells you people have been praying here for a long time, even when they can't explain why. I stepped in at twilight, and the candles made the shadows feel deeper than they should. Villagers sat in silence, a few hands moved, quiet gestures of devotion, then stillness again. The chapel held them the way a bowl holds water, not by force, but by shape. I noticed the side altar before I meant to. Not because it was bright, it wasn't. It sat in shadow, half hidden behind columns and candle haze. And when the flame finally reached it, when the smoke shifted just enough, I saw her. A carved wooden virgin, dark-faced, dark-robed, dark-eyed. Not painted black like a dramatic symbol,
but blackened by time, soot, and centuries of candlelight. Her features were stern, not cruel, just steady, like someone who has watched too much human fear to be easily moved by it. To the villagers, she was simply Mary. To me, she felt like a question. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to decide what I was feeling. Not fascination exactly, more like recognition of something I couldn't name. The way you recognize a melody you've heard before, even if you don't know where. A woman rose from a pew and went to light a candle near the statue. She moved carefully, as if the flame itself deserved respect. The wax caught, smoke curled upward, and the statue's face flickered between gentle and severe depending on the angle of the light. Nothing supernatural happened. No eyes moved, no shadows danced with intention, and still I felt the weight of it. Then I noticed one of our brothers standing in the side aisle. He wasn't there as a guard. He wasn't there for ceremony. He stood in the shadows like a man trying not to be seen. His helmet was off. Chainmail showed beneath his mantle, and when he lowered himself to one knee, he did it slowly, like a man who understood the weight of his own body, the weight of his armor, the weight of whatever he carried inside. He clasped his hands, not theatrically, not for an audience, and bowed his head. I watched him for a long time before he noticed me. Later, outside in the torchlit courtyard, he sat on a bench and pulled his mantle off his shoulders as if it were suddenly too heavy to wear. His face was smeared with dust and sweat. His eyes had the tired sharpness of someone who's been living too close to violence. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for victory. He just spoke one sentence quietly, as if saying it out loud was the only way to keep it from rotting inside him. He said, "I don't pray to win. I pray I don't become a beast." That stayed with me, because it reframed the entire question people love to ask about us. They asked what we worshipped, what secrets we held, what rituals we practiced. They rarely asked what war did to our souls. Most of the men in our order were not monsters. They were disciplined. They were trained to strike clean and stop. They were trained to hold formation and protect others. But discipline is not the same as innocence. If you spend years carrying steel, if you spend years watching men bleed on the road, you start to understand why some people cling to a symbol that feels like an anchor. For some brothers, that statue was not rebellion. It was balance. It reminded them that the divine could also be quiet, patient, maternal, something that didn't demand blood. But symbols don't live in a vacuum. Outside our walls, people were always watching, always guessing, always filling silence with stories. And the Black Madonna, misunderstood or not, became one more spark for rumor. In nearby towns, I heard it myself, whispers that the Templars had strange devotions, that we kept secrets from priests, that we bowed to images the church did not fully approve. None of those whispers needed proof, they only needed uncertainty. A single unusual symbol is enough to feed a hungry imagination, and the church, especially its local clergy, was never comfortable with anything it couldn't frame neatly. A carved statue darkened by candle smoke is a normal thing to an artist. To a suspicious mind, it becomes a sign. So while the villagers lit candles in simple devotion, other eyes were taking notes. A priest glancing too often toward the side altar, a visiting cleric asking why a certain chapel felt different, a bishop's hand tightening on an armrest while he listened to a report he didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. This is how fear grows, quietly, in rooms where men with authority speak in lowered voices. I saw the machinery begin to turn, not with swords, with parchment. A notary in a writing room, quill scratching across paper, pausing to think, then writing again. A report sealed with wax, a messenger mounting a horse, a leather document tube tied to a saddle, a letter arriving at a bigger city where the story would be repeated, amplified, hardened into concern. And every time it moved, it became less about truth and more about control. Inside our commandery, we felt the shift before we could name it. Men began to talk about optics, even if they didn't use that word. They spoke about appearances, about what the villagers might misunderstand, about what a bishop might report, and we adapted the way we always did, quietly. We didn't smash statues, we didn't declare war on the church, we didn't argue in public. We reduced candles at the side altar. We drew a curtain so the statue sat deeper in shadow. We let the chapel look simpler, safer, easier to swallow for eyes that wanted everything labeled. Not because we were ashamed, because we were learning the same lesson again and again. The world will use whatever it can to name you, and once you are named the wrong way, the naming becomes a weapon. One evening, a sealed dispatch arrived at the gate. The brother who brought it had dust on his boots and urgency in his shoulders. He handed it to me, and I held the seal in my fingers without breaking it. I hesitated, not from cowardice, but from experience. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a man's hand is not a knife, it's a message. That night, in the inner council room, we broke the seal carefully. Wax cracked under the tip of a blade. The parchment unfolded in lamplight. Faces tightened as eyes moved across lines I will not repeat. Not because I'm romanticizing secrecy, because the exact words don't matter as much as the feeling that spread through the room, the sense of a net tightening. Someone was compiling stories. Someone was turning whispers into documents. Someone was preparing to decide what we were, whether we agreed or not. After the meeting, I went back to the chapel alone. The curtain was drawn. Only one candle remained near the side altar. The Black Madonna sat behind cloth in shadow, barely visible. I stood at the threshold and didn't go closer. I didn't kneel, I didn't pray to her. I simply looked at the dim shape behind the curtain and understood the bitter irony. A symbol meant to keep men human was now becoming one more reason to call them dangerous. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and across the commandery walls. Somewhere in the distance, a rider passed on the road. Somewhere else, a bell rang. Inside the chapel, the single candle flickered. Smoke curled lazily upward. And then, without drama, without ceremony, I reached out and gently snuffed the flame. The light died. The smoke rose in a thin spiral and vanished into the dark. The chapel became what it had always been beneath the surface of faith and politics: stone, silence, and shadow. And in that darkness, I felt the truth more clearly than ever. What threatened us wasn't the statue, it was the fear of anything the world couldn't classify. And once that fear had been given ink and wax, it would not stop until it found fire.
There's a kind of enemy you can't meet with a sword. You can't ride out against it. You can't form a shield wall. You can't scatter it with a charge. It arrives folded in parchment. It wears wax seals like armor, and it kills by turning stories into law. I first felt that kind of danger gathering in the early years of the 14th century, when the streets of France seemed calm on the surface, markets still loud, churches still full, banners still snapping in the wind, but the halls of power had begun to breathe differently. It started with a king who needed money. Philip of France, Philip the Fair, as people liked to call him, looked every bit the ruler. Sharp eyes, cold posture, a court that moved like a machine. But behind the ceremony, behind the velvet and the prayers, there was a simple problem gnawing at his reign: debt. War costs coin. Bureaucracy costs coin. A kingdom is a furnace, and money is the wood you throw into it to keep it burning. And when the wood runs out, a king doesn't stop the fire. He finds something else to burn. By then, the Templars had become more than knights. We were a network, a system. We stored wealth, moved wealth, protected wealth. Nobles deposited their fortunes with us because they trusted our seals more than they trusted the roads. Kings borrowed because our coffers could do what their taxes could not. From the outside, it looked like divine favor.
From the inside, I knew it was discipline, ledgers, locks, routes, and a kind of quiet competence that made rulers uneasy. And nothing angers a king more than needing the help of men he can't fully command. At the same time, the Church was caught in its own trap. The Pope, Clement, sat beneath banners of holiness, but his court felt the pull of France. Pressure came in polite letters, in private meetings, in envoys who spoke softly and smiled while delivering demands that had teeth. Publicly, the Church still blessed the order. Privately, it began to listen to rumors it would have once dismissed. And that's the second part of the storm. When a ruler needs an excuse, he doesn't always invent one from nothing. He collects whispers, he feeds them, he turns them into evidence. In Paris, the streets around the Temple precinct began to change, not visibly at first, just in the way people looked at us, a pause in conversation when a white mantle passed, a quick sign of the cross from a merchant who had once begged our protection, a priest's eyes lingering too long on our gates. Rumors traveled faster than horses. They said we had secret rites. They said we worshipped strange things. They said we had grown too rich, too silent, too separate. They said we answered to no bishop, no lord, not even the king. Most of it was exaggerated, but it didn't need to be true to be useful. I spent my days in accounting rooms and corridors, between chests and candles, between scales and seals, watching the order work the way it always had. Coins clinked onto balances, wax cooled into hard circles, ledgers filled with neat lines that meant grain, rent, horses, supplies, numbers that kept the machine alive. And at night, I watched a different kind of machine begin to turn elsewhere. In royal chanceries, clerks wrote lists. In archive rooms, officials assembled packets of letters tied with cord. In candle-lit chambers, men pressed seals into fresh wax and smiled at the satisfaction of legality. That's the thing about paper. It feels harmless when it's blank. Once it carries a seal, it becomes a weapon. We felt it long before the blow landed. In the Temple precinct, the older brothers began to divide what mattered, not out of greed, but out of instinct. Documents were copied, then separated. Names were split into fragments. Routes were memorized rather than written. Small coded tokens were handed to trusted hands, because a single full map is too easy to steal. I did what I had been trained to do since Jerusalem. I reduced my reliance on ink. I used scripture like a lockbox. I hid references inside ordinary prayers. I turned places into verses and people into saints' names. I made sure that if anyone seized a page, it would read like nothing. And still, even our silence was becoming suspicious. One evening, I walked the corridor past our storage doors, iron-banded, heavy, secure, and felt the irony tighten around my throat. We had built ourselves into something that could survive storms, yet the storm now forming wasn't outside the walls. It was inside the law. The pressure reached our outposts, too. Inspectors arrived with polite questions. Clerics asked for accounting. Local lords suddenly remembered rights and jurisdictions. Everyone wanted to see our records. Everyone wanted to know what we owned. And the more they asked, the more I understood. They weren't searching for truth. They were searching for leverage. At the ports, the air changed as well. In places like La Rochelle, where ships rocked under gray skies and fog sat low on the water, men worked quietly. Crates were loaded, barrels rolled across planks, rope slings creaked under weight, lantern light trembled on wet wood. People would tell stories later about fleets vanishing, about treasure disappearing into the sea. I won't pretend I knew every ship and every cargo, but I did know this: when an organization senses a coming strike, it doesn't wait to be cleanly cut in half. It disperses, not in panic, in pieces. That was always our advantage. We were not one castle. We were many. We were not one road. We were a web. And still, even a web can be burned if someone brings enough fire. The night before everything changed, I watched the royal machine up close. I saw soldiers gathering under rain-wet torches, tightening belts, checking pole arms. I saw messengers splitting at crossroads, each carrying a sealed order in a leather tube like a dagger hidden in cloth. And I saw the calm on the faces of men who believed they were simply enforcing the will of a king. That calm is the most frightening thing, because it means they don't believe they're doing wrong. Inside our walls, the brothers tried to keep routine: prayer, work, training, silence, discipline, the same rituals that had held us together for decades. But routine can't stop a storm. It only helps you stand when it hits. In one rural commandery, I remember the fog at dawn, thick enough to swallow the road. The banner above the gate hung heavy with moisture. The yard was quiet, except for the soft clack of boots and the faint sound of a bucket on stone. Then we heard it: hoofbeats. Distant at first, then closer, a steady rhythm cutting through fog like a blade. A guard raised a hand for silence. Men stopped moving. Even the horses in the stable seemed to hold their breath. I felt my own hand tighten on the strap of my satchel, the one that held the fragments I couldn't afford to lose. I didn't think of gold. I didn't think of land. I thought of memory. A commander signaled with a subtle gesture: split, disperse, hide what you can. Brothers moved with purpose, not chaos. Some went to the cellar, some went to the chapel, some went to the storerooms. I slipped a coded notebook into my robe. I pushed a floor plank back into place and watched dust settle over the seam as if trying to erase me. Then the fog thinned just enough to reveal shapes at the far end of the road. Mounted men, steel glints, royal colors, spears upright. They didn't gallop like raiders, they came like officials, and that was worse, because raiders can be fought. Officials come with paper. The captain at the front raised a sealed tube: warrant, order, accusation. Whatever was inside it, it would be called law. Inside the gatehouse, our guard turned to me and gave a single urgent nod. Not a question, a signal. It's here. I drew a breath, forced it steady, and told myself the only thing a scribe can tell himself in a moment like that: don't panic, don't confess, don't give them the story they came to write. The gate remained closed. Outside, the king's men waited. Inside, we moved in shadow. And in the silence between those two sides, I could feel the old truth rising again: hard, cold, unavoidable. When power is afraid, it doesn't negotiate. It arrests, it names, it burns. And the worst part is, it does it while calling itself righteous.
That morning felt colder than it should have. Not the honest cold of winter, but the kind that comes when something unseen has already decided your fate. The sky was pale and flat, like a sheet of lead pressed over the world. Even the birds sounded quieter, as if they had learned to keep out of human business. It was a Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. People would later turn that date into a superstition, a symbol of bad luck. For us, it wasn't myth, it was logistics. It was the moment a king proved he could strike everywhere at once.
Across France, royal men moved in coordination, into cities, into villages, into commanderies that had stood for generations. They came with sealed orders and hard faces, and they came at the same time, so no house could warn another fast enough. The world still likes to pretend this happened because of faith, because of heresy, because of scandal. But the truth felt simpler when you watched it from the inside. It happened because power had finally decided we were too difficult to control. I wasn't in Paris when the arrests began. I wasn't in the great temple fortress where the banners flew and the treasury rooms echoed with coin. I was far from the center, in a smaller house of the order, where the walls were thick, the chapel plain, and the records fewer. That distance saved me. The news didn't arrive instantly. It arrived like a knife thrown from far away, late but still sharp. A rider came hard down the road before noon. His horse was lathered, nostrils flaring, breath steaming. He didn't dismount with ceremony. He almost fell from the saddle. "They've taken them," he gasped. Our commander didn't ask who, he asked by whose order. The messenger swallowed, and the answer came out like a sentence of stone. The king's. No speech followed, no outrage, no dramatic prayers, just a long silence where men measured the weight of that word. Because when the king moves and the church does not stop him, there is no arguing with it. There is only survival. We didn't have time to burn everything. People imagine secret orders always have a clean plan, hidden tunnels, prepared escapes, endless time to move treasure. In reality, when the hammer falls, you have minutes. So we did what we had practiced, quietly, without ever calling it a drill. We fragmented. We separated what mattered into pieces small enough to disappear. Papers were divided and disguised, names were removed or rewritten in code. Objects that could condemn someone were hidden where they wouldn't be found quickly. And I took the things that were easiest to carry and hardest to replace. Not gold, memory. I shoved my coded notebook into my clothing. I slipped a few small scraps, things I should never have kept, into the lining of my tunic. I carried nothing that would slow me down. Then we left by the back. No banners, no armor, no cross on display. We split into pairs because pairs can vanish where groups are noticed. We walked like men going about ordinary errands because panic is the brightest torch you can carry. I remember looking back once at the commandery gate, at the familiar stones, the small chapel, the place that had been home in the strange way a soldier can call any fortress home. And I felt something I didn't have time to name. Then we kept walking. By the second night, the rumors were everywhere. Commanderies surrounded, doors broken, brothers dragged from beds, seals cut, chests opened, records seized. And then the worse rumors, whispers that the arrests were only the beginning, that men were being questioned, that they were being forced to confess. People who have never sat in a dungeon love to talk about confession as if it were truth, as if a man tells the truth because the church asks for it. But I learned very quickly what confession means under pain. A confession under pain is not a statement of reality. It is a statement of what the body will say to make the body stop suffering. In the weeks that followed, stories came to us in fragments, through frightened travelers, through sympathetic monks, through men who had seen too much and wanted to unsee it. They said brothers admitted to things they had never done. They said men repeated accusations they had never heard before. They said the questioners already had a story, and they only needed mouths to speak it. And that was the most terrifying part. The king didn't need the truth. He needed a narrative strong enough to justify seizure. Gold can be taken by force, but legitimacy is taken by paperwork. So they created legitimacy out of screams. On the third night of my flight, I slept in an abandoned stable with a roof that leaked. Straw scratched my skin through my cloak. My breath fogged in the dark. I could hear my own heart, and I hated how loud it sounded. I opened my notebook with shaking hands and wrote a single line, just one because I couldn't stop myself. We lost because of silence. The words looked thin on the page, ridiculous and brave at the same time. Then I stared at them until I felt sick, because I knew they weren't true. We didn't lose because of silence. We were attacked because silence made us easy to accuse. There is a difference. Silence is not guilt. Silence is often discipline. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's the only honest response to a world that will twist anything you say. I rubbed my thumb over the line until the ink blurred. I closed the notebook and hit it again. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, a normal sound, as if the world hadn't changed. That normalcy felt cruel. I thought of Hugues de Payens then, even though he had been dead years ago. I imagined what he would say, and it wasn't comfort. It was instruction. Don't write what can kill a man. So I stopped writing what could kill a man, and I started thinking like the Order had trained me to think, in fragments, in codes, in routes. Each day I moved quietly, choosing roads that avoided cities, staying in barns, in woods, in places where the king's reach grew thin, not because I believed I was heroic, but because I knew what would happen if I was caught. They would not ask what I knew. They would decide what I knew and then force my mouth to agree. Some nights I heard distant patrols, hooves on a road, voices carried by the wind. I would freeze, breath held, body pressed into shadow, waiting until the sound passed. In those moments I understood something simple and brutal. What mattered most had never been in a treasury. It had never been in a chest. It was in the habits we carried, the ability to organize, the ability to code, the ability to disappear, the ability to remember without leaving a page behind. The king could seize buildings, he could seize land, he could seize coin, he could seize men, but he couldn't seize everything we had already placed into stone, into practice, into memory. That was the only comfort I allowed myself. Not hope, not triumph, just the cold fact that a secret, once divided, is harder to kill. So I kept moving, not as a knight, not as a martyr, not as a legend. As a man with ink-stained fingers and a burden in his chest that no torture chamber could fully extract, because the most important things were no longer written down. They were carried. And if I lived long enough to bring those fragments to the right hands, then the Order would be wounded, but not erased. The fires of that Friday didn't end.